Great, so now you know how to add navigation bars to your apps. We're going to, in this video, see how to create a stopwatch app, which uses a layout fairly similar to this one. So our aim is simply to have a number of seconds in the center of the app, and then start, stop, and pause buttons somewhere around the edge. Now, if you're feeling really brave, you can go out and Google how to create a stopwatch app with Swift and Xcode and see if you can figure the whole thing out yourself. The ability to work out things just by going to Google or Stack Overflow and finding answers on there is really important as a developer. So if you want to be bold and give that a go, then please do. But for those of you who don't feel quite ready to do that yet, I'm going to go over the technique of creating a timer, which is what we're going to be using in our app. So I'll do that here, and then I'll set you on the challenge to create the stopwatch. So to create our timer, we're going to go over to viewcontroller.swift. Obviously, we'll be doing this in code. And what we'll do here is just create a few lines of code that will print to the logs every second. And that will give you all the information that you need to create the stopwatch app. So we're going to start by creating a timer variable. So we'll call it timer, and it's going to be an empty NS timer. So an NS timer is essentially an object that we can manipulate, and it will control time in somehow or other, within our app at least, not in the real world, unfortunately. So we'll be able to start and stop the timer and work out what the time is according to this variable. And I've created it here inside the view controller, but outside our methods here, so that we can access it wherever we want to. And then all I'm going to do in the viewDidLoad method is set up our timer so that it prints to the logs every second. Okay, so we'll start with our timer variable, and we want to set it equal to an NS timer, but this time we don't want an empty one. We want a certain type of one, and the type that we want is scheduled timer with time interval. Now there's a couple of options there. We're going to go for the second one, that is the one with target rather than invocation. There we go. So there's our quite lengthy definition of our timer object. So we start by setting the time interval. We want this timer to tick essentially every second. So we just put 1 there. And that will mean that this runs every second. Obviously, if you want every 10 seconds, you would put a 10 there, etc. Now, our target is just the view controller that we want to target with this timer. We've only got one view controller, so we target the view controller itself. So we just put self there. Now, the selector is essentially the method that runs every second, or every time this scheduled timer runs. And we're going to create a result function to contain the code that we want run every second. So what we do is we say selector, and then we give it the name of our method or function, which I'm just going to call result for now, but you can call anything you like. Now, selectors are a rather more complicated thing than I'm making them seem here. I don't want to go into what a selector is in full detail. If you want to have a Google, then please do. There's a lot of information out there, as always. But for now, we're just going to think of them as a way of linking to a function that happens every time our timer ticks. So every second in our case. And then the user info, we don't need any. So we'll put nil. And we want this to happen not just once, but over and over again. So repeats is true. So that's the difficult bit, really. We've now created our timer, and this is going to call the function result every second. So before we run this, we're going to have to create our function result. So we do that with func and result, and we don't want to pass any information to this function, so we just use function result and then open close brackets, and then our curly brackets to contain our function code. So for now, I'm just going to print called to the logs. So let's run that. And we should find that once it starts going, every second the word called will get printed to the logs. There we go. Fantastic. That's great. That's exactly what we wanted. So let's just stop that. And now what I did say was that we wanted the number of seconds to display there. So what we're going to need to do is create a variable which we might call count and set that equal to 0. And then each time result is called, we'll add 1 to count. So count will essentially be the variable in which our time is stored. And then we'll display that in the logs rather than just the word called. And that should be it. That should contain all the code that we need to get 1, 2, 3 appearing every second. There we go. Great, so now that you've seen this timer code, you shouldn't need anything else to create our stopwatch app. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video now and go ahead and make an app that displays the time in seconds, nice and big in the middle of the screen, and then has some navigation bars top and bottom that allow the user to start, stop, pause, and reset the timer. Good luck. All right, I hope that worked out for you. I'm going to show you my process. So I'll start by creating a new project as usual. Single view application and stopwatch. I'll just save it there on the desktop. Okay, so I'm going to start by creating the user interface, and we'll do that in very much the same way that we did with our navigation bars. So just to make things easier, we'll resize that so that we can see roughly what we're doing. And then let's drag in our navigation bar at the top. This time I'm going to put it really right at the top, just show you that you can essentially, and set the constraint. So this time we've got 0 at the top. There we go. Nice. And we'll change the title to stopwatch. And then we'll bring in the toolbar at the bottom. So drag it down there and then set the constraints as before so that it will look good in both orientations. And the last main other object is going to be our label, which is where we'll display the time itself. So I'm going to position that so it's right in the middle of the screen, and then I'm going to resize it first. So let's resize it to make it nice and large, and we want to center everything, and I want to make that text nice and big as well, maybe even a bit bigger than that. Great. And then I'll just reposition it again to make sure that it is centered, and then now that I've got that, I can set the width and height fixed, and then I can center it vertically and horizontally in the container, and that will make it nice and centered for both orientations. Okay, now it's completely up to you where you put your start, stop, and pause. I'm going to go for stop down at the bottom left. So we'll just put a stop there. And then I'm going to bring in my flexible space bar button item, and then another bar button item on the right, which will be my play. Let's just get the identifier, there we go. And then pause, I'm going to put up here at the top left. Could put it at the top right, maybe slightly easier to reach even, but you've got the battery symbol to worry about up there. So I'm going to keep it at the top left. Okay, there we go. So now we've got our storyboard laid out more or less as we would want it. I'm going to now have both our windows open at once, and let's create some IB outlets for these objects. So we'll work our way down from the top. So this is pause, and we want that to be an action because we want something to happen when the user presses pause. There's our label. I'll just call it time, and that is an outlet this time because the user can't interact with that directly. And then we've got stop over here, which is an action. And finally, play. And that's an action as well. Okay, so now we've got our user interface sorted. We've got all our outlets. So let's go over to View Controller and get rid of everything else. Right, so let's start where we mean to go on. And the play button is going to be what happens first. The user's going to press play first, so we'll deal with that one first. We need to work with our timer object, of course. So we'll create that up here. So we create it, remember, as an empty NS timer object, and then at play, we'll create it in exactly the same way that we did before. So NS timer and then scheduled timer with time interval. Time interval is going to be 1. Target is this view controller, which is self. Selector is going to be, again, selector. This time, rather than just result, I'll call it update time so that we've got some idea what that function actually does. User info, we don't need any, so nil, and then repeats is true. Okay, so now let's create our update time method. There we go. I don't want var at all, I want func. So update time. So all we need to do here is add one to our timer as before, and then update the time label when we need to. So we're going to need our count variable, which is initially equal to 0. And so just as I did a few moments ago, count plus plus to increment that by 1, and then time dot text is equal to, now ideally we just want to set it equal to count, but you should be able to anticipate an error that we'll get there. This is a string and this is an integer. So a couple of ways you could fix that. I'm going to go for putting our integer into the string like that, but you could use the string function to convert it or do it a number of different ways, but that will do the job. So now we should have a basically functioning app, and I'm just going to run it to check. Obviously we haven't activated the pause and stop methods yet, but we should be able to press play and then see the timer increment on the screen. So let's take a look and see if it does work. Here we go. So there's our label, and if I press play, then it does indeed go 1, 2, 3. Fantastic. And let's just check, make sure everything looks nice in landscape as well. It does. Fabulous. Okay, that's great. So now we just need to implement the stop and pause. So let's start by pausing the timer. Now you may or may not have been able to find this information online, but to pause a timer, you just use timer.invalidate, which is perhaps a slightly odd keyword to use, but That's what we use, timer.invalidate. That will pause the timer. Okay, and then to stop, we do essentially the same thing, timer.invalidate, but of course we need to actually reset our counter, which is count over here. So we need to set count back to 0, and we should also update the label for the user back to 0 as well, so that they can see that it's been reset. Okay, and that's more or less it. One thing I just want to quickly change is I want to get rid of the word label, and I want to initially set the counter to be 0. Okay, let's take a look. We should find now that the start, stop and pause buttons are all working fine. So let's start with pressing play. Excellent. So 1, 2, 3, lovely. And then if we pause, it does indeed pause. And if we press play, it comes back again. Excellent. And then if we stop, it resets to 0. And if we press play, we go back again. Fantastic. So that's exactly how we wanted our stopwatch app to work. Something that might be just worth noting is that when this is paused, this is perhaps, you might think, doing a slightly different process because it's bringing the timer back rather than initiating it. But it's exactly the same code, and it does essentially the same thing. Remember, this timer isn't actually storing our time at all. All it does is essentially running this function every second. That's it. It's not actually keeping track of time at all. That's what our count variable does. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. We now have our timer and it works really well. One nice addition to this stopwatch app might be if you wanted to update the play button so that when you press play, it turns into a pause button. And then when you pause, it turns into a play button again. And that would be a really quite neat way of getting it with just 2 options rather than 3. You don't actually need that pause button, but I'll leave that to you as a challenge. And in the next video, we're going to move on and look at table views. See you there.